A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to video games that are totally awesome. So now, one thing that I might as well make clear here is that with 4 different Transformers games centering around the Bayverse series, it's quite apparent that when The Last Knight had tanked quite badly, they never did make a game off of it for the PS4 or the PS5. However, we have in fact gotten Transformers games even after Transformers The Last Knight had come out. For example, in 2020 we got Transformers Battlegrounds, which from my experience mostly came as a surprise. And I actually did play it when it first came out in 2020. I will say that the unique puzzle or chess sort of feel to it was quite a bit different than what I would have normally expected from a game about Transformers. But wouldn't you know that there have been other games that have come out since then. 2023, of course, was a time when, wouldn't you know, there was a supposed groundbreaking series known as Transformers Earthspark. This was far different than what we had seen before when it came to Transformers continuities. Let's just face it, after the Prime continuity came and went between 2010 and 2017 with Prime and Robots in Disguise 2015, which I've always referred to as Transformers Leadership because Robots in Disguise had already come and gone. And that was back in 2001. In any case though, Earthspark was a bit different than what we had seen before. This one centered mostly around Bumblebee. It's quite fair to say that they have tried in many ways to make Bumblebee the next Optimus Prime. But let's be real here. We've seen this happen multiple times. The attempt to pass down the torch to Bumblebee from Prime or otherwise. And how many times has that succeeded? Practically 0. Even when 2015's Transformers Robots in Disguise had come and gone, the ability to try to make Bumblebee a good representative of the franchise was still well met, but unfortunately, leadership was certainly not his biggest crowning achievement, nor even much of a strength if he put it that together. But he still did whatever he could to protect his brethren and to keep his own planet safe, along with some new human companions. But what does Earthspark do? It does more or less a lot of the same old stuff, and where the Autobots befriend the humans, the two work together in order to formulate a plan to take down the Decepticons, as well as other evils that attempt to use whatever energy they find for evil purposes. In this case, Earthspark centers around Bumblebee being the main protagonist, even though Optimus Prime is also in this game, and for the record, not voiced by Peter Cullen. No. Much like what we'd seen before, it's become clear that eventually Cullen would have to call it quits with Optimus Prime, and it probably is for the best. The guy is old after all, well into his 80s. But, of course, Bumblebee is not alone in this. He has a few other sidekicks along, a few other bots to help him out. Jawbreaker, Hashtag. Yeah, that's mostly just original characters than what we have here. For a game like this that's centered around a new continuity, of course they're going to try and bring along some newer characters into the franchise. And that human characters are basically no exception either. Alex Malto is basically the man in charge of the human side of the story. And I will say, first of all, I've actually not seen Transformers Earthspark, because that show's been around for a few years now, and I am still trying to catch up on a lot of other stuff. I feel like that ought to be made clear by now. So, I'm sure someday I will have to talk about Transformers Earthspark sometime later. Anyways, though, when I tried Earthspark Expedition, this was, in fact, a bit different than what I would have expected. OG, or Outright Games, was the one mostly responsible for the publications, while Tessera Studios was mainly the one in development. So the two were able to pump out what is essentially a more open world exploration hack and slash type of game, with a progression system the ability to collect and find items, the abilities to platform jump in a 3D manner. Certainly not the first game I played with that sort of mechanic, and probably not the last either. Plenty of other games I've played with 3D platforming have also come around. Remember Astrobot? Yeah, 30th anniversary of the PlayStation lineage. But of course, the main thing that we are here to talk about at hand is that Transformers Earthspark is in fact quite a bit different than what most of the other games were like. If you remember when I talked about Transformers Devastation, which was more of a G1 tribute, that came out all the way back in 2015. That was 10 years ago. Wow. Talk about time flying. In any case, though, Earthspark Expedition does something indubitably similar, although it doesn't necessarily give you the kind of perspective that we've seen in the third-person hack-and-slash variety that Devastation offered. This one's a bit more different. This one situates more behind the character rather than in the third-person shooter sort of perspective. Granted, we still are able to get a unique level of combat, including shooting and fighting up close with enemies of all sorts. And Earthspark Expedition, much like other Transformers games, also allows for Bumblebee to transform. I guess one thing that you probably won't be able to do here is that you can never switch to the other characters. There's no human character representation. There's no Autobot Commando representation. No ability to control Jawbreaker or Hashtag or many of the others in hand. Not even get to play as Optimus Prime, which some might find to be pretty disappointing that Bumblebee is grounded to be the only character that you ever play in the entire game, from beginning to end. And I found that you could spend upwards of about 8 hours in total, which, let's be real, that is pretty darn short for a game like this. To come out in a more recent time, I mean, then again, all this really is just scouring through a few different worlds, fighting a few bosses after you complete some prime objectives, some optional side quests and fetch quests, as well as the occasional treasure hunting in the form of cards. Yeah, collecting cards in a Transformers game. Wasn't it already enough when Mattel was doing this? Now Hasbro's joining another game? Who really knows? I guess it's just the fact that card collecting is still a big tradition, like in the olden days. Yu-Gi-Oh!, Bakugan, Pokemon, Magic the Gathering. Yeah, that's just to name a few. But you know what? We know that Megatron is the main antagonist in Transformers. But guess what? A guy named Mandroid, a certain doctor whom has in fact had quite a time with Bumblebee in the past. Like I've said, I have not gotten involved in Earthspark whatsoever. Earthspark Expedition has been my first ever experience with the franchise. My ever experience with this continuity in general. And so I will say, I'm more than pleasantly surprised at the fact that they had the guts to rewrite Transformers by having a human antagonist. Then again, this is not exactly the first time we've seen this happen. The Bayverse films made more than enough opportunities to give us antagonistic human characters. I mean, remember in the first film especially? Man, that alone was quite phenomenal. Probably even better though when Kelsey Grammer stepped up in KSI, Operation Cemetery Wind. Whew, only to get blown away by Optimus. Talk about anticlimactic. Should have had Mark Wahlberg punch him to death for what he's done. Horrible writing, y'all. Anyways, though, in the case of Earthspark Expedition, we go to one world in particular, then we go to another world, and then another world. We're basically brought into, let's say, the desert first, where Alex and Bumblebee maintain good contact, with Optimus occasionally chirping in, and some of the others also go around the map. You can find them on the map itself, sets of markers, so that way you create a good waypoint to drive to. Yeah, while you can get there on foot, it seems driving there happens to be a lot more fun. And besides, there are some pretty cool racing situations that you can put yourself in. In fact, there's a lot of good opportunities that you can scour around and look for. So that way, you have a lot of good playtime for the money you might spend on a game like this. I went ahead and got the PS4 version. Because remember, I did not get a PS5 until later. There was a lot of PS5 content that I practically made on my PS4, practically making it meaningless to have to own the console just for that purpose. It's mostly for the performance upgrade. But hey, I'm glad that I listened to the viewers. And not only that, but I was able to spend additional money for upgrading and decorating. So, are you happy now? Anyways, though, Transformers Earthspark Expedition, while I will say it does have the tendency to practically feed off of what the older games had given already. I mean, open world exploration, hack and slash, RPG progression systems, these are things that are definitely not new. They've been around for a pretty long time. And we know by now that most modern gaming happens to be adopting a lot of these different things. It seems pretty difficult to try to invent something brand new. But I guess in that sense, what would the Dark Pictures games do for something like this? Why they would try and bring old things back to the future and make them fresh and new. They not only look that way, but they feel that way. Yeah, Bandai Namco was able to pull off a lot of stuff. Imagine if Bandai Namco actually got a hold of Transformers. Just think, there's Japanese as Transformers' original owner. Hasbro mainly controls the American side of the franchise, and we know that they're not exactly West. But to be fair, Transformers Earthspark Expedition does chalk it up to being quite a lot better than, let's say, how Transformers Battlegrounds was basically just some weird, elaborate chess game. Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. Basically bringing along another continuity in the form of a game when Prime couldn't do it enough, twice that is. I mean, we've seen the next continuity do that. Then we got Earthspark doing it. And then, of course, in 2024, there came along Galactic Trials, which I can't really say is supposed to be relevant to, let's say, Transformers 1. I mean, the design of the characters and animation style that they chose here seem to be interlinking to that movie in particular. But, like I said, next time of video games that are totally awesome, consider the fact that I might actually review that one next. But for Earthspark Expedition, my experience with that game, defeating all the main bosses, including Grimlock, whatever happened to him being an Autobot? I mean, sure, he was dumb, a simple brain and all, but does he really have to be a full-on bad guy? It's almost calling back to G1 when he went completely psycho with the other Dinobots. And the only way that they were able to become more obedient was to eventually learn from the Autobots, you know? That was the problem that they had. They had simpler brains. You can thank Wheeljack for that. But Grimlock here, he must have been made by the Mandroid himself. That's just sad, you know? Sad, sad, sad. Even Robots in Disguise Grimlock knew when to do better than what he did. I mean, he wore the Decepticon insignia for crying out loud at first. But he grew to be quite a reliable and somewhat playful teammate with the Autobots. But hey, you know what though? I'm more than willing to let go of a lot of the flaws that this game has gotten. The fact is that it felt more fresh than what the other Transformers games had given to us. And in the end, defeating Mandroid actually felt like a somewhat elaborate yet satisfying experience. You know, operate a few things here and there, expose his weak point, and then fire at him. That's basically all you had to do. But really? Not exactly a great way to put things together, don't you think? I feel like even mining for those crystals being that as the end goal. I mean, the whole thing about stopping Mandroid was to prevent him from getting his hands on these crystals in the first place. this kind of crystal technology that goes back a long time. According to what Alex Malto and others have put together, it's a big history lesson that just seems to revolve around present day events that are occurring. But hey, the power of crystals, Bumblebee himself and the rest of his team now have in safe hands. I'd say that is more than deserved. Anyways, though, I feel like that the biggest thing that I might as well address here is the fact that at the time I played Earthspark Expedition, it was from a rather serious point in my time. Just think, it was only a year ago when I first played this game. And when I last did, of course. I managed to beat the entire game in around 8 hours of time. And while I will say, the overall progression that I put in there, I didn't put 100% on the game itself, but I did finish at 86%, which is still pretty good. I'll admit, there were a few things left out, some collectibles, including some cards that I couldn't find in the maps, as well as some extras that were made possible by some of Bumblebee's teammates. I didn't do every single side quest. It probably wouldn't have been that necessary anyways. And I also haven't exactly explored every single inch of every single map within the game's storyline and environment. But thyroiditis. That's the one thing that I tend to get a lot of vibes from. Even when I look up my own gameplay, the clips that I made, it was kind of fortunate that I was actually able to cope through with such a horrible condition like that. A condition that almost caused me to die. Yes. It got so bad that I had to go to the ER for over a day. They were able to stabilize my condition and get my heart rate situated, but I was still stuck with hyper symptoms for over a month. I ended up losing nearly 40 pounds that whole year, mostly because of this. My metabolism was just through the roof. Unnecessarily, of course. And what made it even worse was the fact that my workplace had some criminal activity at the same time. So you could say that that march in particular, I originally started with some pretty good intentions and a lot of stuff that I managed to do, but it very much ended poorly. Very poorly. But anyways, though, Transformers Earthspark Expedition was still a pretty decent game. Not exactly a great way to put together Earthspark in its own entirety, but hey, taking these old mechanics and gameplay functionality and putting them all together into something that feels a bit more fresh and new. I mean, Transformers. We've had tons of games over the years. Way more now than ever. And with the latest installment, Galactic Trials, I'm sure that we'll probably have something similar. But like I said, it'll be my first time playing Transformers on the PS5. Since I have the console now, I probably won't revisit Earthspark Expedition since I've already completed it, first off. But for my scoring of this game, it'll be probably a lot better than the last one, Rise of the Darkspark, at 7.2 out of 10.1. But still, not exactly a great place to be at when you think about it. It could be probably a lot better than some other Transformers games. Even older ones weren't so well represented in the franchise because they're rare and obscured. They kind of suck. Even AVGN would know that. Anyways, though, that's it for today's episode of Video Games That Are Totally Awesome, and I'll be back again with Galactic Trials.